8 years after the Brexit vote, checks that have already been delayed 5 times finally arrive at the UK border. From today, European food and plant imports considered at risk of carrying disease will face inspection.
A quarter of the food we eat each year is imported from the European Union. The government is clear that the new border controls are absolutely necessary. They will give us a better protection, the government says, from diseases in mainland Europe.
But industry says adding checks will increase food inflation by adding costs for importers and consumers.
We think there's going to be £1 billion worth of extra cost put onto food coming through Dover port alone. So restaurants, delicatessens, fish and chip shops could well be affected by what's currently happening today, and the consumer in the very near future will start to see some of those food products going up in price.
Some UK sellers fear the border checks could force their EU suppliers to quit or increase their prices.
Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in the United Kingdom, and specifically to talk about new Brexit rules that were introduced on the 30th of April 2024 that have the potential to both increase the price of food and also lead to food shortages in the UK. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, Brexit, are you kidding me? Didn't that vote take place back in 2016? Almost 8 years ago, and you'd be absolutely right if you were thinking that. This is ancient news in terms of the Brexit vote. However, it has taken 8 years for the UK to finally put in place all of the rules and regulations regarding Brexit. And the new rules regarding food checks have actually been deferred on 5 separate occasions over the last 2 years, but they are now finally in place. And what these rules mean is that anything that's classified as a medium risk product in terms of food and plants, so this covers plants and flowers as well as meat, dairy and fish products, potentially now have to go to a separate centre and be checked to make sure that they're not bringing in any potential dangerous diseases or mites or insects into the UK that could impact on the UK's biosecurity regime. So in today's video, we'll go through a brief history of Brexit and talk about why it's taken 8 years for these rules to finally be put into place. We'll have a look at what the cost of Brexit has been to the UK economy so far, because there was a recent study, and I can tell you it is a lot. It has cost the UK an absolute fortune so far. We'll then have a look at these new rules and regulations that have been brought in to protect the UK's biosecurity regime and what the potential cost of all of these checks is going to be, and also talk about the potential for food shortages occurring in the UK. We'll then have a look at what's going on with inflation, and specifically food inflation in the UK, because the UK has been suffering as a result of Brexit, because prior to the Brexit vote happening, the UK sourced the majority of its imported food from the European Union. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the impact of these new changes will be on food prices and the UK economy overall. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you so much for the time and effort you've taken to do that. Really, really appreciate it. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee membership or YouTube membership, thank you for that long-term support. Really helps to keep me going, keeps me motivated, and keeps me posting videos on a regular basis. So thank you. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, the United Kingdom, whilst it's located in the continent of Europe, is actually an island, so it's physically separated from the rest of Europe. And the UK is made up of 4 different countries: England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And in terms of joining the European Union, the UK actually joined what was called the European Economic Community back in 1973. And interestingly, in 1975, the UK held its first referendum to decide whether or not the people of the UK wanted to remain as part of Europe. And interestingly, that vote went in favour of staying in Europe. So 2 years in, everybody was happy being part of the EU. Now, one of the turning points came in 1979 when the European Commission decided that it was going to bring in an exchange rate mechanism to link all of the currencies from all of the key trading partners. Now, at that time, the UK decided that it didn't want to join. It didn't want the pound being linked to the other currencies. However, Margaret Thatcher changed that decision in 1990, and the UK joined what was called the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism. Now that didn't really work out very well for the UK because at the point of entry, the UK had interest rates of 15% and was sitting in the middle of a deep depression. And the problem was the rate that you fixed at when you went in was the rate that you were always benchmarked at. So the UK was always under pressure in terms of that exchange rate. And the United Kingdom had an obligation to protect the exchange rate. And what happened was that over time, a lot of pressure was placed upon the pound. And a famous deal doer called George Soros started shorting the pound. And on the 14th of September 1992, everything came to a head on what was called Black Wednesday. And the UK government, which at that point was being run by Prime Minister John Major, had to spend billions of pounds bailing the pound out. They announced on the 14th of September that interest rates were going to be increased from 10%, where they were sitting in the morning, to 12%. Later that day, the Bank of England said it was considering increasing the rate further to 15% in the same day. And Norman Lamont, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, announced at 7 p.m. on the 14th of September 1992 that the UK was leaving the exchange rate mechanism forever. And the estimated cost to the UK on that day was £33 billion. And George Soros and all of the other people who were selling the pound made an absolute fortune. And from that day forward, the British pound was held entirely separately from all of the other European countries. So when the euro was introduced in 1999, Britain did not go into that currency, and it's had an independent currency ever since. But despite not being included in the euro, the UK remained one of the largest contributors to the EU and had to spend billions of pounds every single year contributing to European courts and legislation and laws and all sorts of other rules. And in the period building up to the Brexit vote in June 2016, there was growing discontent amongst a section of the UK population about the fact that the UK was having to contribute billions and billions of pounds to all of these European initiatives, and also the fact that it was no longer in control of its borders and its rules and regulations and laws. And on June the 23rd, 2016, 72% of the UK voting population turned out to make their vote either to remain or leave, and 52% voted in favour of leaving. Now, interestingly, when you look at the split between the different countries, England and Wales voted in favour of leaving. However, Scotland and Northern Ireland voted in favour of remaining. And that's caused issues. Subsequently, Scotland then decided that it wanted to leave the United Kingdom. It held its own referendum, and interestingly, the majority vote was to remain as part of the United Kingdom. And there have been growing calls since that time for Scotland to have another vote, but I don't think that that's going to happen. Now, interestingly, at the time of the vote, the UK's Prime Minister was a guy called David Cameron, and he ultimately decided that because the vote had gone against what he wanted, it was time for him to resign. Now, here's an interesting question for you. There have been 4 Prime Ministers of the UK since then. In the last 8 years, there's been 4 different Prime Ministers. Can you name them? And I'll check out whether you can at the end of this section. But basically what we've got is over the last 8 years, we have had all sorts of red tape and rules and regulations and discussions about how Brexit was going to work. Because one of the key issues that's caused a major problem with Brexit is that Northern Ireland has a land border with Southern Ireland, and Southern Ireland isn't part of the UK and is actually part of the European Union. So Southern Ireland remains as part of the European Union, Northern Ireland doesn't. And so you can't just bring in straightforward rules, because things can be transported over that land border. So the UK had to start working out how it was going to deal with the physical border, rather than just having the ocean where we've got water separating the majority of the UK from Europe. In Northern Ireland, you've got a land border. And before anybody sends me a message, I know that Southern Ireland is actually really just called Ireland, but in the purposes of this discussion, it's easier to refer to it as Northern and Southern Irelands. So the bottom line on the Brexit vote is that it's irreversible. The UK has left the European Union, but it's taken 8 years to put the rules and regulations and the details of how it's going to work in place. So now we'll go on to talk about what the cost of Brexit has been to the UK. But before we do that, I'll come back to the question as to who the 4 Prime Ministers since David Cameron have been. And I'll give you a clue. There have been 2 female and 2 male. The first who took over directly from David Cameron was Theresa May. She was then replaced by Boris Johnson. He was then replaced briefly by Liz Truss, and that might have been the difficult one for you to get. And then the current Prime Minister is called Rishi Sunak. In 2018, a Cambridge-based consultancy called Cambridge Econometrics was instructed to undertake analysis as to how much Brexit has cost the UK economy. And those results, which have just been published, show that the UK economy in 2023 is £140 billion smaller than it would have been if Brexit hadn't have happened. The report shows that the UK has 1.8 million fewer jobs today than it would have if Brexit had not happened, a fall of 4.8%. And there are approximately 290,000 fewer jobs in London in 2023 compared with the pre-Brexit scenario. There are 523,000 fewer jobs in construction nationwide, with 81,000 less in London. There are 388,000 fewer jobs in financial services, with 92,000 less in London. The average Briton is nearly £2,000 worse off, while the average Londoner is nearly £3,400 worse off. UK gross added value, a measure of the size of the economy, is approximately 140 billion less in 2023 than it would have been if the UK had opted to remain in the customs union and single market, a drop of 6%, and London's real GVA is more than 30 billion less in 2023. Cambridge Econometrics also believe that the economic damage is set to increase should the UK retain its current relationship with Europe. As an example, by 2035, the UK's real GVA will be around 311 billion lower, more than 10%, than it had if it had not left the EU. And in terms of the impact on the cost of living prices, the analysis shows that 30% of the increase in food prices between December 2019 and March 23 can be attributed to the effects of Brexit and have added over £210 to household fuel bills, costing UK consumers a total of £5.8 billion. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, from the 30th of April 2024, all food, plants and flowers that are designated as being medium risk, so have the potential of bringing some sort of bacteria or insects into the UK, have to have health certificates that are provided by the destination, but also will undergo random checks to make sure that none of the products that are being imported into the UK run the risk of affecting the UK's biosecurity. So basically what this means is that a large percentage of the food that's being delivered into the UK is potentially going to have to be checked. It will be taken to a special area in different parts of the UK where it will go through a sifting process, so there will be actual manual checks. People will be checking this produce to make sure that it doesn't carry any insects or any other problems. And that's going to add a lot of cost to all of the food importers for the UK. And the way that this will work in reality is that a fee will be charged if you're importing any of those sort of products. And those fees vary from £10 to £29 for individual produce, or a mixed consignment will be charged a fee of £145. Now, the UK government is estimating that these fees will add £330 million to the import costs of all of these type of products. However, independent analysis is showing that that figure is significantly less, and it's more likely to be in the billions. And when we're talking about an industry where margins are relatively low, when you're talking about the food industry, people aren't making an absolute fortune. The profit margin on food is relatively thin. So if you're having to pay £10 more or £29 more or £145 more for a mixed consignment, that's going to add directly to your costs, and therefore you're going to have to pass those costs on to consumers, because businesses in the UK won't be able to absorb these costs. We've already seen a lot of food inflation over the last few years as a result of Brexit, because suppliers have had to change. People have had to buy from different areas whilst we've gone through the rules and regulations and trying to establish exactly how trade with European countries is going to work. And what these new rules and regulations are going to do is add further to those costs. But in addition to the increase in prices, there is also now a risk of food shortages, because this is going to add further delays, because if these consignments do have to be physically checked, then they'll have to be taken to these sorting centres, and that's going to add delays and potentially could lead to empty shelves in the UK. And also, I think what we're going to see here is that the buyers are going to start thinking about different supply chains. So rather than buying from the European Union, they can avoid all of these additional checks if they're buying from elsewhere. And one of the bizarre things, I think, about these new checks that have been brought in is that prior to the 30th of April, no checks were required. So over the last 30 or 40 years, all of this produce has been imported into the UK and everybody's been happy to just carry on as they were. But now that the UK is outside of the European Union, it's decided to bring in these new rules which say that everything has to be checked. So nothing has actually changed in the world apart from there's new rules which are implying more cost, which potentially is going to be passed on to consumers and therefore has the potential to drive up inflation in the UK at a time when it's been coming down towards the target level. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation over the last 12 months in the UK. And as you can see, this time last year, inflation was running at 8.7%, which was significantly higher than the 2% target set by the Bank of England. However, over the last 12 months, there has been a significant reduction in inflation. And in March 24, the official rate of inflation was 3.2%, which is not that far away from the target rate of 2%. And there's a lot of talk in the UK at the moment that the official rate of interest, which is currently sitting at 5.2% and has increased rapidly over the last couple of years, will start to be reduced because inflation is now back under control, and so the Bank of England can start relaxing rates. If we now have a look at what's been happening with food prices over the last 12 months, you can see that the situation was significantly worse. This time last year, food prices were increasing year on year by 19%, so that was more than double the official rate of inflation. However, over the last 12 months, food prices have started to come down and they've reduced consistently. And in March 2024, food prices year on year increased by only 4%, which is double the target rate of 2%. Now, obviously, what we're talking about in today's video has the potential to impact on this reducing inflation. And let's not forget that 4% inflation still means that food prices year on year have increased by 4%. We're not talking about a reduction in food prices. We're talking about a slowdown in the rate of increase in prices. So 4% is not too far away from the Bank of England's target. However, if these new rules and regulations do add more than £1 billion worth of cost to the food industry in the UK, we could see food prices starting to increase again, and that will delay the Bank of England in terms of its thought process of reducing interest rates. So these new rules that have been brought in for Brexit do have the potential of disrupting what the Bank of England has been doing with regards to bringing down inflation. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's going on with regards to Brexit is really fascinating, because 8 years is such a long time for the rules and regulations and the laws to be put into place. Brexit was something from 2016, but we're still talking about it today because it hasn't finished yet. And the full impact of Brexit is unlikely to feed through into the UK economy for another 12 months or so, because now that these rules are in place, we're going to see high levels of checks. We're going to see more cost feeding through into every business that has to import food from the European Union, and those costs will be passed on, and so it's likely to continue driving up inflation, and the ultimate impact is probably going to be a delay in the reduction of interest rates. And for most consumers in the UK, that's the key thing that they're looking at. They're looking at food prices and they're looking at interest costs, and they want both of them to come down. But unfortunately, this new rule that's been brought in is likely to push both up. We're going to see an increase in food prices. Probably inflation will stay high. And we also run the risk of having empty shelves in the UK as a result of the additional checks that are going to need to take place. Because whenever you bring in a new system, there's always problems and delays and glitches. So it's likely to be worse than everybody's expecting. And in today's video, what I wanted to do is really take a bigger picture view of Brexit and to talk about what the impact has been on the UK economy. And as we've seen from the data, it's had a huge negative impact so far. It's estimated that the UK economy is around 140 billion lower today than it would have been if it hadn't have decided to leave the European Union. Now, obviously, there are other political reasons why the UK decided it didn't want to continue being part of the EU. So it's not all about economics. But for the majority of people in the UK, the economic impact has been the thing that they've noticed the most. Apart from passports have changed, and when you go on holiday, you need to make sure that your passport is still in date. Otherwise, you might get turned away from some of the European countries that previously you could just stroll into. But the overall summary of today's video is that the new rules and regulations relating to Brexit are likely to increase both food prices and reduce food availability in the short term in the UK. That's potentially likely to drive up inflation, and that's potentially likely to delay any reduction in interest rates. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.